welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast series. I'm Nina Lockwood, founder and director of Intuitive Interim and Executive Search. Throughout this series, I will be sharing engaging conversations with talented leaders from across the UK transport sector. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anit Chandarana, Lead Director of the Great British Railways Transition Team, to join me on the virtual couch for this week's podcast. Good morning and welcome, Anit Chandarana, Lead Director for Great British Railways Transition Team. That's going to be one heck of a name badge with all that great big title on it, isn't it? My word. A very warm welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast, Anit. It's an absolute joy to see you this morning.
Thanks, Nina. Brilliant to be here. Just getting ready for my holidays later this week, so couldn't have picked more perfect time.
Brilliant. So we'll be part of your cool down and easing yourself into your annual leave, will we?
That sounds good.
I'll do my best. So as in Intuitive Insights tradition, we're going to start off with a journey through your career story to date. I'm absolutely confident that everyone that's tuning in to this conversation on the podcast will know you as having worked with Andrew at Network Rail and now being the lead director at GBR TT. I'd love to know more about what that actually entails when we get to that part. But can I ask you to take us right back to the beginning, Anit, please, and talk us through your journey so far in terms of your career?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if we want to go right back to the beginning, I think my career journey starts at about 6 years old. And it's not because my parents were into child labour, it's because that's the first time that my mum recalls me saying something about what I wanted to be when I was kind of older. And even at that early age, apparently she tells me I told her I wanted to be an accountant. So whilst my peers wanted to be astronauts or train drivers was quite a common thing, I wanted to be an accountant. So some say I was destined to be boring from an early age. I'll let others judge that.
I disagree.
So and actually that was my dream for most of my career. It influenced the subjects I studied at school, at university. I did accounts and finance. I went to Kingston University to study that. And I chose that particular institution because it had the highest levels of exemptions for the professional exams that went forward. So it was a real, key driver. Following university, I struggled to get what I would call a proper job. So in kind of a graduate scheme or in an apprentice type environment or so on. So my mum was working in my local Sainsbury's at the time, and she got me a job pushing trolleys because I was getting bored at home, and I said to her, haven't they got something for me to do? And when you have kind of interesting things that happen because somebody just does something that makes a difference. And the store manager kind of happened to ask me what I was up to and so on. He clearly knew my mum. He said, well, if you've done accounts and finance, maybe I should have you counting money in the cash office rather than pushing trolleys around. So I graduated to that. And actually he became a crusader on my behalf because he kind of was clear, he could see that what I really wanted to do was study to be an accountant. So he went out of his way to find who I needed to talk to at Sainsbury's head office, and as a consequence, I got a place in one of their finance departments, and they sponsored me through my studies. And so that for my first 5 years, I worked at Sainsbury's various finance roles after that first one, and I culminated in being financial controller for their bakeries division.
Can I just interrupt very quickly there? What was it about you that store manager saw? Why didn't he just leave you pushing the trolleys on it? What do you think it was about you that encouraged him to be a crusader on your behalf?
So Nina, that's a really good question, and one that personally I find quite difficult to answer because of who I am and my makeup. He clearly did see something there, and I'm not sure I ever asked him that question. But if I were to, what would I hope he'd say?
Yeah.
Or what do I think he'd say? One, he was a people-centric person. You could see that I wasn't the only one that he took under his wing. He had this kind of passion around his job as a store manager was to make the most of the people that were under his care for the time that they were there. So one, he had that kind of certain bent to him. Secondly, I wasn't kind of a quiet trolley pusher, I had opinions and I'd speak about them, and maybe there was something in that kind of meant that I had a conversation with a store manager, a trolley person, that perhaps most trolley people just weren't. They'd be overly deferential or so on.
Yeah.
So what that, and many times in my career, people have often talked to me about this. If you're not prepared to have a conversation, then don't be prepared. Don't be surprised people won't listen to what you've got to say. Maybe there was a lesson. Really interesting question. I probably hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, I can think that's brilliant advice. Is to speak up, and there is a tendency, isn't there? Perhaps not as much now as there was maybe when we were in the early parts of our career. But yes, if anyone had the title manager or director, or had come to in my world in banking, if somebody came from the head office, then why would they want to speak to me? Because I was a teller. I was sitting on the counter, kind of cashing checks and taking deposits in. So there was that feeling then. But amazing advice actually there is to be willing to have a conversation with whoever.
And actually, when I mentor people and I share that advice, and maybe there's a certain kind of person that comes towards me because of my characteristics, I think there is still that kind of stigma. There is still that I know my place and therefore I'm going to sit in that place. And actually, I think it is also one of the characteristics of minority groups. You see that in minority groups more. So you may know that I'm a non-exec director in the NHS, and I was in an interview there, and one of the interviewers one of the resourcing team who does lots of interviews was very clear that some of the behaviours that we saw as consistent behaviours from the women in the interview process, from some of the ethnic minorities, was driven by that kind of sense of standing back a bit more, and she was talking about how it's a common pattern. So something for us as leaders to think about when we're
absolutely need to be aware of this, most definitely. I'm glad we took that little detour, but I'll take you back to Sainsbury's.
So 5 years on from Sainsbury's, I then joined Shell UK Retail at a point in time where they were getting much more serious about the non-fuel retail offer. So they were looking for people from places like food retail, fascinating journey for me, because if you'd have said to me even 2 years before I left Sainsbury's, did I envisage myself not being at Sainsbury's for a significant longer time, I'd have said no. I could see myself being here for the majority of my career, because I loved it there. I really enjoyed the fast-paced nature of food retail. I really enjoyed the way that their finance function was seen as part and parcel of their organisation, not something that sat to the side of the organisation. But when the opportunity came along from Shell to join them on retail, what I discovered was actually the being involved in something that's new, that's fresh, was something that really interested me. Being that opportunity to set that up, and actually joining that organisation when it was under significant challenge, because my organisations like Sainsbury's were really hitting them hard on fuel margins, and they were no longer the fat and happy fuel retailers they could be. And during my time at Shell, I did a number of things, always in their UK retail business, which is effectively the petrol stations you see at the side of the roads.
Yeah.
I went from helping them set up their non-fuel offer in the stores, still in a finance role, still in kind of financial analytical role, and over time moved towards what they call their franchise model. So the fuel retailers that own their own premises, but then the brand is franchised to them. And I guess that was my first real experience of operating as part of a leadership team, not being a finance support to one of the leadership team that then takes it, being on leadership teams. And I don't mean the most executive team, but I mean a leadership team that was there to do something and specific and accountable. And it was the first place where people started talking to me about, do you really see your role or your future as an accountant or something different? And I have to admit, the first time somebody asked me that question, my reaction to that was, why don't you think I'm very good at finance? And actually, what they were trying to tell me was maybe you've got the ability to think broader than finance and the conversation. But I stuck steadfast to my dream of that 6-year-old boy wanting to be the best finance director I could be. So I continued there. And then I described probably the first time that I took a wrong step in a role because I chose to do something for the wrong reason. So this was while I was at Shell, and we had moved out of London. We were originally, as in the work location. When I joined originally, we were in Waterloo, and they had a program of kind of moving out of London. So we moved out of London, and I was desperate to get back to London. And I took a role that, whilst it was finance, was actually one that was much more back office finance. Right. And I really learned something there about a number of things. One, whilst I'm not a believer in having a really dedicated career plan where you know every step you're going to take for the next 5 years and the next 10 years, not having some idea of what really I was about as opposed to what the role was about, led me to take a slight misstep in that job. It was a job that didn't get me. It did the debits and credits of accounting fine, and lots of people will tell you that's not probably my biggest skill set in finance anyway. But it was a pure accounting for accountants type role. It wasn't an accounting and business type role. And I found myself at a misstep. We corrected that very quickly. Shell had a brilliant kind of program of helping people reach that. But it was one of those life's journeys on a career journey that actually you need a bit of a slight selfishness about your career choices, which is about what's good for you. Don't allow that to make you too risk averse or too hesitant, but do be clear about the job is as good for you as it is for everyone else, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So 2003 is when I left Shell, and I joined Network Rail. And I didn't join Network Rail because it was in the rail industry. I never really saw the rail industry as something I wanted to be a part of. I didn't see it wasn't, but it wasn't something that I'd been attracted to. The reason I joined Network Rail was because at that time I'd begun to think about the IT industry and wanting to have a career in the IT industry, only because there was a bit of geekery around me and it just was something that I found interesting. And the role that Network Rail had to offer was in its IT department, based in near Great Portland Street. So I thought, well, I'll join them for 2 years. I'll have then, IT under me, and I'll be able to then think about joining the IT industry. But like so many people that join this industry, very quickly, this industry got under me because and there's a real something for us to think about as leaders here, because I never understood what the rail industry was really about as an up-and-coming graduate or so on. I didn't take time out to understand it, agreed, so I hadn't done my part. But it wasn't something that that would have drawn me to it. But what I really learned in those 2 years is actually how important the rail industry is to this country.
Yeah.
And it really, as I say, it really got under my skin in a way that I didn't anticipate.
You're certainly not alone there, are you? There's so many people that I've spoken to over the last, it's nearly 10 years now since I've been working with the rail industry. And so many people feel exactly the same, myself included. You know, I pitched my tent here because I thought that there was a need for change and transformation. And so therefore, people like me able to bring new talent, new ways of thinking, etc., with new people would be needed. So that was me hedging my bets in terms of how quickly that change and transformation was going to come about. But it was so quick on it, this feeling of, I never want to work in any other industry. Because the people that work in rail are just, and it's, you know, it's going to sound cliched, and to anyone who doesn't work in the rail industry, that they're not going to get it. But it's once you're in and you see the people, the passion, the drive for actually doing the right thing and getting people from A to B from whatever reason that is, it's huge. It's a huge attraction.
Agreed. And I think the breadth of careers that are on offer in the industry. When I talk to graduates, particularly with my background in finance graduates who join the rail industry, you know, there are. If I think about my background, for example, at Sainsbury's, yeah, it's a huge organisation. But actually, the experience offer there is relatively narrow. You know, it is a food retailer. It's a fast-moving consumer goods business. And therefore, it's a very profit and loss orientated business from a financial perspective. And there are other businesses you could think of which are very balance sheet orientated, you know, long-term businesses, contracting type organisations that we'd be familiar with in the rail industry. Whereas actually the rail industry is an industry which can offer that full breadth. And I speak of that from the narrow perspective of somebody from finance. But actually, you know, when you talk to people who've had long careers in the rail industry, it's quite interesting as to actually within one career, how many different professional kinds of roles they've had. And I don't mean kind of formal profession, I mean in terms of subjects that they've dealt with. You know, you've got people who will have worked in train operations, infrastructure operations, who may have worked in asset management. And actually, there aren't that many industries that do offer that breadth and actually allow people to move around in that way. So, and maybe just to go back to kind of my career story. 2 years, I did leave Network Rail in 2005 for 2 years to go and run my own business. It was a kind of a secret dream I'd had for a long time, and I kept putting it off because, you know, it'll be better in 2 years. I'll be a bit more comfortable with my mortgage. I won't have so many commitments. And the thing I realised was there was always going to be a good reason not to give it a go.
Absolutely.
But I did. 2 years which were an incredible roller coaster ride. Me and a partner set up a business selling chickens to Sainsbury's, which isn't quite as abstract as it sounds given my experience. We made some horrible mistakes along the way, and the business folded at the end of 2 years because we were naive. You know, it'd be really tempting to blame the horrible food retailers and so on, but actually they did their job, we didn't do our job, and we folded at 2 years. But what was interesting then, at the end of that 2 years, there was no hesitation about what I wanted to do, which was come back to the rail industry,
right,
and join that. And then after that, culmination of finance roles through Network Rail, and then in 2020, I took on the role of Chief of Staff at Network Rail, which was my first non-finance role.
Yeah.
And now, if you say to that 6-year-old boy, what would you want to do? I probably would give a different answer to, I want to be the best finance director. It really, doing the chief of staff job really took the blinkers off my eyes about actually the ability to have a greater adventure beyond that. And now, if you said to me, what's next? Actually, life will tell me what's next when we get there. Okay. Will it be a finance director role? It might be, but it may not necessarily be. It may be something different.
Can I ask you just to explore that a little bit further on it? When you saw the job description for the chief of staff role, were there particular things that jumped out at you that said, I really want to chuck my hat in the ring for this role because it's exciting because, and I guess equally were the things that you thought, not sure about
that. So was it a leap into the unknown, and was there a hint of fear in that? Of course there was for me, right? So the story here goes something like this. Andrew said to me, look, I've decided I want a chief of staff, and have you got any thoughts about who might be interested in that? And what I didn't recognise, that what he was saying to me was he'd love for me to put an application in, but I didn't see that, and it took him 3 conversations for me to see that, by which time I probably failed the interview, if I'm honest. And what appealed to me was, one, I'd got to know and was working closely with Andrew, and working, for anyone who's worked with Andrew before, you'll know that actually he's an incredibly inspirational individual to work for, but in a really humble, straightforward way. And the thought of having that closer working relationship with Andrew was a huge positive for it. I've been at Network for a long time, and therefore I knew who people were, and therefore and as a chief of staff, that's a huge opportunity, particularly given Andrew was still relatively new to Network at the time.
Yeah,
I knew the job had a strong element of working with DfT on the Williams review, and I'd already been involved in that, and that was something I was keen to continue doing. And then there was kind of, from a very personal perspective, there was a realization that in a lot of ways, the jobs I'd done in, for example, finance director roles supporting various functions within Network had quite an element of what was expected from a chief of staff, being a key number 2. And and the combination of all of that gave me the courage to do something that I'd frankly been a bit fearful of before, which was stepping out of my professional line as finance director. And I don't look back at all with any hint of regret of having taken that decision. I absolutely would say that was the best role I've had in my career ever.
Fantastic. And another example, I guess, of the store manager back at Sainsbury's, with Andrew kind of recognising something in you.
Yeah, correct.
That it took you a while to catch up with the programme in terms of, I perhaps could do that. So yeah, quite interesting again in relation to how you see yourself versus how others see you.
Absolutely. There's no question of that. And we should talk about that for a moment, because it goes back to that kind of self-awareness, self-analysis, reaction. So it will be no secret to many of your listeners who know me that imposter syndrome is something that is about me. And what that looks like for me is I often have this feeling of I'm here by luck, not by my hard work, not by my efforts, not by my success. And there have been times in my career where that has been really debilitating for me. Right. And I've had to figure out ways to manage that. Lots of people I've talked to about this tell me it's not something you'll ever be able to let go of completely, but actually understanding the signs of when it's preying on you are really important. And once you do, my journey has been, once I see those signs, now I know how to recognise them. Actually, there are lots of positive things you can do to overcome those kinds of signs. Really simple things like somebody once noted that it's really difficult to say thank you to me, or it was really difficult to say thank you to me, because I so felt like I didn't deserve thanks that it was difficult for somebody to say it to me. So the simple act of accepting thanks is a really good technique for somebody who has imposter syndrome. And the other one that is important is, because I can't recognize as well in myself when I've done a good job or I've done something well, is actually to keep in my drawer, to keep a list. Literally just a list of what have I done where I've succeeded, because some of your listeners may know well Rob Brighouse, who's had a long career in the industry. Yeah. Something he said to me once, and I'm not sure he ever recognised the imposter syndrome, but it was a really opportune moment. Was that as leaders, a lot of us look continually up the mountain about how far we've yet got to climb, and particularly those who come from kind of my background of imposter syndrome. Every now and again, you do have to look how far you've come up the mountain, just to remind yourself. And that's what my list of achievements is about. It's to remind myself about the mountain I've climbed as much as the mountain I've got to climb.
That is such brilliant advice, Anit. It really is. And I think, when I'm talking to people who are looking for their next career adventure, my advice constantly is to look at what you've already achieved. And quite often we see CVs that are a kind of little mini job descriptions. There'll be a job title and then there'll be a few bullet points about what that role is. And what I'm really interested in is what you've done. So what have you achieved? And I think to have that ongoing book that you go back to, whether that's I think end of the week, wrapping up after the week, what's gone well this week? Because it is so easy to look at, as you've just said, to look at what you've still got to do in terms of how am I going to get to the top of that mountain. And quite often when you get to the top, you realise that actually there's just another bigger mountain behind it that you've got to do next. That is amazing advice. Thank you for that. So on from the Chief of Staff into Great British Railways.
Yeah, indeed.
Tell us what a lead director does for GBRT.
Yeah. So my rather flippant answer is when I figure it out, I'll let you all know. But actually, that's not fair, and I'll do my best to describe it. So basically, we've got a team in GBR Transition Team who and we've got two big jobs to get done. One, which is to stand up the GBR and the operating model of GBR, and the other is to try and bring the industry together in the interim to deliver better outcomes in between now and standing up GBR. And therefore, my role as lead director is to lead that whole group and to try and achieve that. I'm accountable to Andrew and to Sir Peter, who in turn have been commissioned by the Secretary of State to stand up the transition team and to do those two things. And as part of that role, as well as that direct accountable to Sir Peter and to Andrew, Conrad is the SRO for the programme overall, so I also have an accountability to him. Ultimately, the buck stops with me. That's the easiest way of me, putting it. When we started setting up GBR Transition Team, for a period of time, I was double hatting. I was continuing to do the Chief of Staff role, as well as doing this lead director role. And in about October last year, Andrew and I sat down and went, that's not a tenable option for anyone. So we agreed that we would replace the Chief of Staff role at Network Rail, and I'd take on the GBR Transition Team. So, for better or for worse, that's what the role that I've chosen to do in a quite atypical fashion for me, actually. You know, that even when I came home and said to the missus that I'm doing this, she clearly was very, very happy for me, but she was like, yeah, normally I'd have really had to persuade you to do this and have a good long conversation with you about it. And honestly, if you ask me what was different and why, it's difficult to pinpoint, other than given the choice, who wouldn't?
Yeah. Absolutely.
The opportunity to make this kind of difference in an industry that I think is so important for us as a nation, and that I think can do a much better job of delivering the outcome for passengers, for freight users, for taxpayers, for the country at large. Who wouldn't?
I think there might be some people watching who would say, well, I wouldn't. I'd be running 100 miles an hour in the opposite direction, because it's going to be hard. It's not an easy job. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is that as we've listened to your career story, and it's been very much about, as you've said, you know, it's about accountancy, it's about finance, and then finding in your time with Shell, having your first leadership role, and starting to discover that actually it's not just about the numbers. It's about the people side of things and the behaviours side of things, and I think you have such an unassuming nature about you in terms of how you present yourself, that people are attracted to that, in terms of being led by you, because you're very straightforward. Or certainly that's my experience of you.
Well, that's very kind, and you know, others will judge me for that. And one of my journeys on leadership, maybe just to kind of touch on that, in terms of mindset, was, so, you know, I grew up in the 80s, and my impression of leadership was people like Margaret Thatcher, and business barons, who would typically be portrayed as, you know, this kind of table thumping, decisive individuals who for whom unassuming would be the very opposite kind of description that you'd give, and as a consequence of that, that's not something I ever identified with. And frankly, the other issue at the time in the 80s was there were no leaders that looked like me. You know, there are no leaders from ethnic minority backgrounds. Indeed, in one very important aspect, Margaret Thatcher was very atypical for a leader, because she was a woman, and that wasn't, the norm. And whatever our political views are, that was a threshold moment to see a woman prime minister in the 80s, which was kind of, you know, now we look back, was still a very non-diverse world. So, yeah, and so I never thought of myself as either being a leader or having the qualities of leadership. And it was an individual who, during my early time at Network Rail, who really took me under his wing, Ian Coucher, who was our chief exec at the time, and kind of begun to show me the diversity of what leadership meant, and actually really encouraged me to. I used to run a process which meant that I engaged with kind of exec and leaderships of Network Rail at the time. And before the sessions would happen, Ian and I would review the papers, and he'd say, "What's your views?" and so on. And one of these pre-sessions, he said to me, "How come you never expressed this view in the meeting itself?" And I said, "Well, it's not my job. My job is to be the secretary to the meeting and da da da." And he went, "Well, if that's what you always want your job to be, then great. But, you know, you've got something to say it." And he dropped me in it in one session. He said, "Well, Annie, you've got something to say about this. Why aren't you saying it?" So I said it, and I learned. And what was really interesting in that environment which is why I think things like kind of secondments, rather shadowing and so on, is really important to people coming up in the industry. Was the conversations that happened around that table started opening my eyes to actually leaders are no different to me. They do put the proverbial trousers on one leg at a time.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. What I meant that, so it's not that they were no different to me and I'm as the same as them. They were just people.
Yeah.
And they were different. And maybe when I saw them in some kind of official forum, either I put them on a pedestal and put that veil over them, or they felt the need to put the veil over themselves. But it opened my eyes, and it's where my eyes first kind of went, maybe that's kind of what I aspire to be. Still in the finance field at that point, but a leader in the finance field. Important little life journeys along the way.
Really, really important. I could there's so much to unpack and explore here. So we'll leave that for another time.
Sure.
And which I'm really excited to come back to. For the purposes of today's podcast, let's move on, Anit, to where I get my metaphorical magic wand out and say, we're in interesting times, I think it's fair to say. So we're recording this on the 7th of July. There are interesting things happening. We've just Mr. Johnson is just about to vacate number 10 as we speak. All sorts of other stuff going on. Taking all that, I guess, into account and looking at what you would like the future of the railway to be, what would be your 3 wishes?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, look, the railway will endure all of that. The railway is important to the country and it needs to be here. So we'll endure all of that. But if, in terms of wishes, first of all, we say we want to put the customer at the heart of the industry, and I think that's just so important. The railways can do a huge amount of good. We know, what they can do. They bring people together. They create moments of happiness. They create business opportunities. They are a driver of our economic and social well-being in the country, and we saw that. So really, really thinking about the customer, it will only do all of those good things if people use the railways, and people will only use the railways if we're really clear about what do customers want that is going to get them to use the railways. And I don't mean what does the customer want, and you just have to do everything they want. What does the customer want that's going to get them back onto the railways? It's a lesson I learned when I was at Sainsbury's and other retailers below that, and I forgot over a period of time. And being back in the role I'm doing now, it really comes home to me. So wish number 1 is that customers see us living the dream of putting them at the heart of everything we do. Wish number 2 is this concept of simplicity. I think it's what we need to do to deliver number 1, but much more than that. Both by necessity and by accident, we have created a world that's incredibly complex. And in a lot of ways, we have passed that complexity on, for example, to our customers. If you take a look at our fare structures today, we say to the customer, we can give you whatever fare you want, but you're going to have to find it and figure it out for yourself. And that leads to a position where customers don't trust us in terms of fares. They believe, lots of our customers tell us they walk away from booking a ticket believing that they could have got a better option somewhere, but they ran out of time. So that's my second one, about simplicity and rationale for that. And the third wish is around diversity, inclusion, and equality. Doesn't matter what anyone tells you, we as an industry are not well shaped in that way. I can tell you, people, and my particular drive is around ethnic because of my background, but I know this applies to all, everyone who's from a minority background. Doesn't matter what your organisation tells you, we are way behind in this agenda.
Agreed.
I know that, for example, when we ask people from an ethnic minority in Network Rail, what is your lived experience in Network Rail, it shocked us.
Yeah.
And so my second wish is, regardless of your background, feeling like you can be yourself in our industry. And I'll be clear, this isn't because somebody tells me there's a business case for it. This is just about justice and fairness. And so my third wish is that we can deliver an industry that has equality, diversity, and inclusion as part of what it is.
Yeah,
we're a long way from that.
Agreed. We need to do it. We need to have an industry where we can all feel that we are welcome and we can be ourselves. And 100% agreement from me that we are a long way from where we need to be. 3 wishes which speak very much to my heart, I think in terms of all 3 of them, Anit, and let's hope that there are enough people, and trust that there are enough people who are working in the industry who want that too, and we're all facing in the right direction, and we're going to up the pace and up the momentum to make this change happen.
Agreed.
So one last question before we bring this particular conversation to a close. In terms of, and I kind of feeling like with the third wish there around the diversity and inclusion and the equality, I feel like I want to mention here that you have very, very kindly agreed to take part in a live webinar later this year, in terms of that particular subject. So it'll be the third in our series of 3 for 2022. We've just held one earlier this week, which we've had amazing feedback. I saw, yes. Incredible feedback all around the subject of belonging and being yourself. So as many of these conversations as we can get started, the better. And my thanks to you in advance for being our very special guest later in the year. So, Anit, I'm going to ask you to leave us with one more thought in relation to something that has helped you and something that's inspired you, and asking you to share the title of a favourite book that you have read that you feel has really supported you in your career and life, I guess.
Yeah, no, really easy one for me. There's a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by a lady called Susan Jeffers, and it's about how she coped with imposter syndrome. She had a big role as a consultant in a hospital, doing important work. No one would ever guess that she suffered from imposter syndrome, and it describes her journey, and it really resonated for me. As something that helped expose for me the feelings I was having, just came home to me.
Yeah, thank you. I read that book many, many years ago, and I completely agree with what you've just said. And what you've done there is given me a nudge to get it back off the bookshelf again and give it another read. And I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, as I do every single one we have. I learned something. I feel inspired. I feel positive about the future. I'm really delighted that you are in the position you're in the industry, because we talked on the webinar earlier this week, the phrase accidental leader came up, and the fact that it works for some people, but actually other people we need to give a lot of support to help them go from a functional their functional job into a leadership role. And I just think that what you are bringing to the party is so of its time, and so what this industry needs. So my best wishes to you for more success in the future, and my huge thanks to you for joining me on the Intuitive Insights podcast.
Not at all. It's been really good fun, and thank you for inviting me to join. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anit. Huge thanks to Anit for what I think you will agree was a really open, honest and thoroughly interesting trip through his career story to date. Huge thanks, and thank you to you for listening.